coming into the parliamentary estate, and also to just be aware of each other as you're moving in and out of this space, this room today. Order, order. Chris Bryant to move the motion.
Mrs. Miller, it's a great delight to sit under your chairmanship, and it's always a delight to be with you in the same room. And I beg to move that this House has considered the matter of Magnitsky Sanctions. If global Britain is to mean anything, it has to mean a passionate commitment by the United Kingdom in every corner of the globe to liberty, personal freedom, a fair trial, the rule of law, freedom from torture, freedom from slavery, freedom of association, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and the right to a family life. Sometimes that will be inconvenient for us and for other countries. We may want very strong trading partnerships with Colombia or Saudi Arabia, but we will always find it difficult to do business where human rights are trampled underfoot. I've been banging on about all of this for many, many years, and if I might just explain where this starts from, it goes back to 1986 when I was living in post-dictatorship Argentina. And one night I was having a drink with a friend who I knew had had a difficult time during the dictatorship, when someone came in and sat at the next table to us. And a few moments later my friend disappeared, and I presumed he'd just gone to the toilet. He didn't come back for a long time, so I went to look for him. And he was in a shuddering mess on the floor of the toilets. And I said, "What's up?" He said, "That man at the table next to us tortured me for 4 months." I said, "How can you possibly know that? Because you told me that you were blindfolded throughout that time." And he says, "Well, the thing is that if somebody has every single day for 4 months grabbed you and shoved your face into a bucket of shitty ice-cold water until you nearly drown, has tied you to a metal bed and applied electrodes to the back of your tongue, the back of your ears and your testicles, and has beaten you senseless every single day for 4 months, you get to know not just what their voice sounds like, not just the smell of their breath, but the way they come into a room and the way they sit down at a table." That's how I know it was. So ever since that day, really, I've just thought how fortunate we are in this country to enjoy liberties and freedoms, which are guaranteed to us by our democracy and by battles that people have fought in previous centuries. And that's why I still fight today to end human rights abuses, and I'm proud that in memory of the lawyer Sergei Magnitsky, a suite of Magnitsky Sanctions is now available in British law, and I pay tribute to the government for introducing them. For me, building a network of liberty, to use the Foreign Secretary's phrase from this morning, must mean more than just expanding free trade. It must mean expanding freedom. Sometimes, I have to say, it has felt that the government has been reluctant to act. How many times did we have to urge the Foreign Secretary to act in relation to Hong Kong? I still find it perplexing that Carrie Lam is not on any list. And why is the UK list of those sanctions so much shorter than the US version? Do they care more than we do about human rights? I don't think so. So as co-chair of the new all-party parliamentary group on Magnitsky Sanctions, I asked the government to consider some names. And my co-chair and I are going to be doing this on a fairly regular basis, or that's our aim. It's important that we have privilege in Parliament, and that privilege we don't want to abuse, but we do want to be able to speak without fear or favour about human rights abuses around the world. Let me start with China and the situation in Xinjiang, where... That was very quick, but yes.
Well, I just want to thank the honourable gentleman for his speech and giving way, and just to put on record the Liberal Democrat support for Magnitsky Sanctions, and indeed welcome the cross-party support on this issue, which is shown in this room. He will be aware, and members will be aware, that the Uyghur Tribunal is going to report tomorrow. And in that tribunal have been harrowing stories given by Uyghur families of what they have suffered. Would he agree that tomorrow would be an ideal time for the minister perhaps to announce sanctions against CCP officials like Chen Chuangguo, who, as the Communist Party secretary of Xinjiang, would have overseen these crimes against humanity, and we all know those would potentially amount to the crime of genocide?
Well, that's pretty much going to be my paragraph next but one. So, yes, of course, I completely agree. And I mean, the Uyghur population have been and continue to be subject to mass detention, forced sterilisation, forced abortion, the forced removal of children and other forms of torture. And to my mind, and I think in law, that is genocide. It meets all the criteria that are laid down in the conventions. The UK government has so far omitted to sanction several of those most responsible for these atrocities, all of whom have been sanctioned by the United States. And I understand that some of the detail on this has already been provided by non-governmental organisations to the FCDO, and I'm sure the Minister has that. So in reference to the gentleman that the Honourable Lady just referred to, he is referred to as the architect of the human rights abuses in both Xinjiang and Tibet. He's the party secretary to the Communist Party in the region. He's responsible for the mass detention, torture and cruel and degrading treatment of over 1 million ethnic and religious minorities. I still find it perplexing that parts of the Middle East, where there are fellow Muslims, still fail to condemn this. The recently released Xinjiang papers confirm Guangzhou's role in directing the government's policies in the region, and he should be sanctioned, of course.
And I thank the member for giving way and speaking an excellent speech, as well as the papers from Xinjiang papers. You know, as we talked about Chen Kuan-go, who was directly assisted by his deputies, Xu Heilun and Xu Chengji, in implementing the mass internment of the Uyghurs. Now, I understand the government sanctioned 4 Chinese officials, but that's not enough. So does the honourable member agree that the government must now take steps to introduce further Magnitsky sanctions, including Chen Kuan-go and the architect of the Xinjiang genocide, and of course also the deputies?
Yes, I am normally very, very reluctant to draw direct parallels with what's happened in Nazi Germany. But if I'm honest, when you see detention camps and you see people being taken away from their families and you see people being identified by virtue of their genetic makeup, it feels remarkably similar. And if the world chooses to turn away at this point, I think in the end it will regret it. There's an important point here too about the Xinjiang Production and Construction Company, the XPCC it's known as, which is a state-owned paramilitary organisation. It's known for its involvement in the mass imprisonment and severe physical abuse of the Uyghurs and its use of forced labour to produce the majority of the region's cotton. As the recent report by the Helena Kennedy Centre for International Justice shows, this cotton ends up in the global supply chain, and quite often you can't spot that the clothes that you're wearing have come from slave labour. While the UK has recognised this use of forced labour and sanctioned a subsidiary of the XPCC, it has yet to sanction the corporation as a whole itself, despite the fact that it controls large swathes of the region's industries associated with widespread labour abuses. And in particular, in relation to that, I think it's important that Peng Jia Rui and Sung Jing Long, both of whom have held senior positions in the XPCC, and had command control over the arbitrary detention, ill treatment and forced labour of Uyghur Muslims, should also be added to the Magnitsky list. Also, Hua Liu Jun, as the former party secretary for the Public Security Bureau in the region, he oversaw the use of artificial intelligence to racially profile, track and imprison members of the Uyghur community. Recent reports indicate this same system was used to target and forcefully sterilise Uyghur women. Should also be on the list. Let me turn to Iran. As many members will know, since 1979, Iran's arbitrary detention, torture and ill treatment of foreign and dual nationals for diplomatic leverage over other states has escalated, with state hostage-taking becoming an institutionalised part of its foreign policy. We have seen this most notably, obviously, with one of our own nationals, with some of our own nationals, including Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe, who is being held hostage in Iran and is now spending her 6th Christmas away from her husband, Richard Ratcliffe, and their daughter, Gabriella, and also Anusha Ashuri, who has now been detained in Iran for 4.5 years. Our heart goes out to them. Again, I understand that detailed evidence in this has already been provided to the FCDO, but let me list some people who I think should be added to the sanction list. Ali Ghana Atkar has acted as head of interrogations and as judge in Evin prison. In his role, he has been involved in the ill treatment of detainees, particularly in the use of forceful interrogations and threats, and in bringing false charges against them. He should be on the list. Gholam Reza Ahi, who is the former head of Evin prison, which has become synonymous with torture and death, and is where a number of British nationals, including Nazanin and Anusha, have been detained. As the head of the prison, he was responsible for the inhuman and degrading treatment of prisoners and was sanctioned by the European Union in April of this year. He's been sanctioned by the EU, but not yet by us. I think he should be on the list. Ali Rezvani is an Iranian state media journalist for the IRGC-controlled 2030 News. He has not only been involved in the interrogation of detainees, but has also revealed detainees' interrogation files, broadcast forced confessions, and forcibly detained family photos, and has spread misinformation regarding political prisoners, dissidents, and hostages. He has peddled propaganda against victims to justify and encourage their ill treatment, thereby promoting, inciting, and supporting Iran's practices. He should be on the list. Sudan. On the 25th of October 2021, the military staged a coup in Sudan, overthrowing the joint civilian and military transitional government. Since then, violence has escalated rapidly, with reports of the military torturing and killing protesters and carrying out enforced disappearances. It all sounds remarkably like Argentina. Again, I understand that evidence has been provided by the FCDO, but let me give some names. Abdel Fattah al-Burhan is the leader and public face of the military coup in Khartoum. Security forces under his command, targeted activists, members of resistance committees, and journalists, ordering their arbitrary detention or enforced disappearance. Al-Burhan has also implemented an ongoing internet blackout, trying to prevent news of his human rights abuses from leaving Sudan. He's failed, but he should be on the list. Mohammed Mdan Daglo, known as Hamedi, is the commander of the Rapid Support Forces, previously known as the Janjaweed, the government-supported militias which committed gross human rights abuses in Darfur. Under his leadership, the RSF played a critical role in the planning and execution of the coup, and have repeatedly used excessive force to beat and kill protesting civilians in Khartoum. He should be on the list. Abdel Rahim Mdan Daglo is reportedly an active member of what security analysts have described as a small security council responsible for the planning and execution of the coup. This council has directed the militarized response to the protests, including the use of live fire against peaceful protesters. He should be on the list. Let me turn finally to Rwanda. In August last year, Paul Rusesabagina, the subject of the film Hotel Rwanda, which many members may have seen, and a vocal critic of President Kagame, who in fact is suffering from cancer, was drugged, bound, and forcefully returned to Rwanda, where he has been imprisoned and tortured. I've met with his daughters online, and it's a very upsetting story. A large number of international human rights organisations have recognised this case as one of enforced disappearance. There are two individuals directly involved in this case. First, Johnston Busingye, who was the Minister of Justice at the time of Mr. Rusesabagina's arrest, and under whose authority he was detained and tortured. During a televised interview, Johnston Busingye admitted the government of Rwanda paid for the flight transporting him back to Rwanda. Johnston Busingye has since been removed as Minister of Justice and appointed as High Commissioner to the United Kingdom. As far as I understand it, the UK has still not yet given its agrément to this appointment. I hope it will announce today that it has absolutely no intention of doing so, because he should be on a list of sanctioned individuals, not people being escorted to Buckingham Palace to have their credentials agreed by Her Majesty. Secondly, Colonel Jano Ruhunga. He is the Secretary-General of the Rwanda Investigative Bureau, who was also heavily involved in the unlawful kidnapping and the associated human rights violations. Mrs. Miller, all of these names, I believe, should be added to the list of those who are sanctioned by the United Kingdom. Of course.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for him securing this debate and for the work he is undergoing as one of the co-chairs of the all-party group that he mentioned. If I'm fortunate enough, Mrs. Miller, to catch your eye, I hope to raise the case of General Shavendra Silva, a man currently Chief of Defence Staff in Sri Lanka and apparently responsible for gross human rights violations, including torture and extrajudicial killings. I appreciate the need for my honourable friend to focus his remarks today, but could I ask him if his all-party group might consider that specific case at a further session down the line?
I think I can see my co-chair is telling me that we will. So yes, undoubtedly. But my honourable friend makes a really good point, which is that we need a proper process whereby all of these suggestions and these concerns that individual members have from their connections with other parts of the world, so that we can feed them into the government and get good outcomes. Right at the beginning of this process, when I think I asked the former Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead, something like 27 times when they were going to introduce Magnitsky sanctions. We now have them in place, but the whole idea was that there would be a parliamentary process for assessing who else should be added. We want to work with the government to achieve that, because in the end, we all share our humanity. If a child goes hungry in Botswana, that's a problem for the children of this country. But if somebody is deprived their freedom in Russia, in Chechnya, in any part of Africa, that is a matter for our freedom too. We all share in the same humanity.
The question is that this House has considered Magnitsky sanctions and human rights abuses. I plan to call the front bench at around 4 minutes past 6. We have 4 speakers on the list. If you do the maths, that's about 5 minutes each, and we'll all get in. And I'll call Ian Duncan-Smith.
It's a pleasure to serve under your stewardship. Can I start by saying that I am a co-chair, as was referred to earlier on, and we are in complete agreement about this. I am going to just resume the list, as it were, but not in the detail that my, in this case, honourable friend actually laid out. But I do want to make this point that we should do so without fear of any retribution, because this is the natural form of debate. And I say that as someone who's already sanctioned by the Chinese government. And my answer to them is, yeah, so what? Anyway, moving on, I just want to say that there are all these countries that we have mentioned, there's already been mentioned. It's really important that we, having got the Magnitsky sanctions, of which I congratulate the government for having done it, I make no question about that. They've shown willingness to take some actions, and we've actually put some people on the sanctions list. But, as has already been said, we are not going far enough and fast enough, and I think this is the whole point of the APBG and this debate today. So can I just start with China? Now, as I said, I'm sanctioned, and I must just say to the Minister today, today the Prime Minister got up and said categorically, as I could understand it, that the policy of Her Majesty's government is now to have a diplomatic boycott of the Winter Olympic Games in China. I think I was not alone in hearing him say that. He even illustrated it by saying not just would not ministers attend, but he also made the very clear point that officials would not attend, and thus, de facto, it is a diplomatic boycott. Can I just make that on the record and hope that my honourable friend will take back to the Foreign Office the clarity of that statement, because as far as we are concerned in the Chamber, and now publicly, this country has now got an official diplomatic boycott on that set of Winter Olympics, and there can be no difference of opinion about that matter. So I just want to go through, and the reason is because the abuses in China are so phenomenal. I mean, they lead all the other countries completely behind them. The level, the scale, the ferocity of the abuses is quite unprecedented in modern times. when you think about the Uyghurs and the genocide, and I say genocide, I know the government doesn't want to say that because they stand by this whole legal stuff about having to get it either through the UN or through the International Criminal Court, but China's not a member of one, and the other it blocks, we know that. So every other country that I know of any great potency, the Americans have all declared it a genocide. And tomorrow, the Honourable Lady is quite right, there will be the final outcome of the tribunal, and there's no question in my mind that new names will come from that in due course, which we will look to get sanctioned. But genocide of the Uyghur, oppression, suppression of the Tibetans over decades, forced labour camps. We should actually call them what they are. They're concentration camps. They're not forced labour camps. Why do we try and find another phrase that takes the meaning out of it? As an honourable friend said earlier on, these are concentration camps because this is redolent of that terrible time when we turned our back on so many, and so many people died as a result. So not just that, the Christians, the Falun Gong, now the Inner Mongolians, they're arresting and persecuting peaceful democracy campaigners on a daily basis, threatening their neighbours, taking over the South China Seas, killing Indian soldiers, and threatening to declare war on Taiwan. I don't know how much more a country can do to tell you the direction of travel it's going in. It's not as though they're hiding it, and it's not a secret from us anymore. They're very clear. And we need to react to that and make it clear that they are not, therefore, going to get away with it. And that is why the names that have just been mentioned, I'm going to repeat them now. In China, we've got Chen Chuango, who's already been talked about as the architect and the party secretary of the Communist Party. He is the key to the whole design of the nature of what they're doing. He was also the key to Tibet, as I am not uncertain that my honourable friend will no doubt make that point. Then we've also got, unusually, the Xinjiang Production Construction Corp. To ban an organisation is interesting to bring Magnitsky sanctions, but it is state-owned, and it is clearly a paramilitary organisation, and it is up to its eyeballs in what is going on now in Xinjiang. We've got Sun Jinglong, who is both senior position at XPC, it was mentioned earlier on, and very, very clearly part of that Uyghur genocide suppression. We've got Hua Luojun, who was the former party secretary of the Xinjiang Public Security Bureau, and he has overseen critically the area of artificial intelligence and racial profiling. Racial profiling. How can we say that now in this day and age, that people are being profiled and chased because of their race? This is something that, is almost like reading out of a book of the 1930s. So we go to Iran, and I won't make any more than has been made already because we are limited on time, but I simply say Iran is another despotic state at the moment that cares nothing for human rights, the rule of law. And I want to repeat the names that have been mentioned already. Ali Gan Akhtar, head of interrogations and the judge in Even prison, ill treatment of detainees, all the rest that's been mentioned. This man should be on the list. Ghulam Reza Ziyarati, former head of Even prison, as well, should be on the list. No question at all about that. Ali Rezvani, Iranian state media journalist, and also involved in the interrogation and brutalization of detainees. In Sudan, it was already mentioned, but I repeat again, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, leader of the public face of the military coup in Khartoum, a brutal individual, commands security forces and hugely implemented in the ongoing arbitrary detention and enforced disappearance of key players in that area. Mohammed Hamdan Daglo, commander of the Rapid Support Forces, and also known as the government-sponsored militias, which controlled gross human rights abuses in Darfur. Many others has already been mentioned. I want to come to Abdul Rahim Hamdan Daglo, who is reported as an active member of what security analysts have described as the Small Security Council, a brutal individual and responsible for the planning and execution of the coup, plus also the detaining and the torturing of many people in that country. In Rwanda, finally, Johnston Busingye. And I do reiterate this point. Just exactly what do they think they're doing in nominating this well-known and abusive individual who's been so responsible for so much of what is going on in that country as an ambassador to London? Goodness gracious me, I have no idea. Whether they think the UK is an easy touch for some reason and that they could easily get this individual in here and it would all be all right, we really would need to see a very strong statement from the government first and foremost, and secondly, to make sure I'm just finishing now, Mr. Miller, I'm just finishing now. And finally, Colonel Janro Ruhunga and Secretary General of the Rwanda Investigations Bureau, heavily involved in detention and in torture. And I simply say to my honourable friend, the reason I'm repeating that list, as my co-chair has also said the list, it's because whatever happens after this, I want to share a part of that. The government now must sanction these people, at least as a start.
On the list, Gareth Thomas.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Miller. I cannot compete with the quality of the two previous speeches. They were both excellent. I pay tribute again to my honourable friend for securing the debate. I simply want to raise the case of one particular individual who now holds the position of Chief of Defence Staff and Commander of the Sri Lankan Army, General Shavendra Silva. Those who've followed the terrible events in Sri Lanka at the end of the conflict in 2009 will be aware that evidence has emerged over the last, nearly 12 years, of widespread human rights abuses at the end of the conflict, including extrajudicial killings and an extensive use of torture, the deliberate attacks on civilian targets, including hospitals, and the use of weapons that have been banned internationally, such as white phosphorus and cluster munitions. Despite repeated efforts, Mrs. Miller, by the international community, the Sri Lankan government have resisted any efforts to bring to account any of those responsible for those abuses. But despite their best efforts, there have been groups of individuals and NGOs that have chronicled the evidence of those human rights abuses. And the Minister, I hope, is aware that on the 9th of April this year, the International Truth and Justice Project submitted to her department a 50-page dossier setting out General Shavendra Silva complicity in the human rights violations that took place towards the end of 2008 and through to May 2009 in the north of Sri Lanka. General Silva then was commander of the elite 58 division of the Sri Lankan army, who were very much involved in the conflicts. Now, it's fair to say that the US has already imposed a travel ban on General Silva and his family, having found him accountable through command responsibility for, I quote, gross violations of human rights, namely extrajudicial killings by the 58th Division of the Sri Lankan Army. And so the question is why we have not followed suit as a country and imposed similar restrictions on Mr. Silva, particularly around travel, but also around financial assets, etc. And in our countries, the tools available to our country under the Magnitsky package of measures held at least one person who's responsible for those terrible abuses at the end of that conflict, properly responsible. And I look forward, I hope, whilst the Minister will quite rightly feel a responsibility to answer the questions and points made by my honourable friend, I would be very interested to hear, in particular, as I know my constituents and many others across the UK will be, on what her department's reaction is to that dossier that the ITJP submitted back in April.
Tim Lawton.
Mr. Miller, thank you very much. I don't know whether I have to declare an interest as a fellow sanctioned MP. It's slightly ironically, it means rather than I have a negative financial interest, given all my assets have been frozen in China. If I had any in any case. But let me put that on the record for good measure. Mr. Miller, I know I'm very much the Secondary Support Act in the two proposers of this motion here today, who I congratulate and for their work with the all-party group, because this is a really important subject. And I'm very proud that we have taken a lead with the Magnitsky sanctions already announced, but I'm frustrated that we haven't gone further and faster. And if this group can continue to put pressure on the government to do that, then it will be doing very good work indeed. We must become a leader in the way we apply and enact Magnitsky sanctions to encourage as many other like-minded governments around the world to follow suit, because it's really important that we maintain a multilateral and coordinated approach so that the impact is such that those targets and the countries of which they are part of the regimes in most cases simply have to sit up and take note, and it causes maximum disturbance and annoyance and inconvenience for them. So it's really important that we don't just name people under Magnitsky sanctions, but we follow through to make sure that they are very effective and have the desired impacts. It's not just a box-ticking exercise. And we should be doing a lot more to investigate their assets. London, I'm afraid, has become the home too often to some of these despotic regimes and despotic people who prop them up through property and other largely hidden assets. And we should be redoubling our efforts to investigate the laundering of money through London, and particularly the London property market. Now, I'm not going to alarm the Hansard recorders by going through a whole list of difficult to pronounce and even harder to spell names. I will certainly reinforce the references we've had from both the original speakers to Shen Guangzhou, the architect of the genocide in Tibet. Under his watch, many of the now more than 1 million Tibetans who have lost their lives since the invasion by the Chinese Communist Party government back in 1959, overseeing the eclipse of the teaching of the language, of the culture, of the religion of many ethnic Tibetans, putting hundreds of thousands of nomadic farmers simply getting on with their lives in the ways that their generations and ancestors have done for centuries, into concentration camps under the guise of retraining, slaughtering their herds and forcing them into a sinicized lifestyle, which is very alien to many of those Tibetan people. And then, of course, now that was a training ground for what he's now doing in Xinjiang, and we've heard all about the forced sterilisation, the concentration camps, let's call it out for what it is, the slave labour farming of cotton and others. So Magnitsky sanctions must just be the start of us clamping down on all of these. There's a limit to what we can do. We can have trade boycotts, we can have limitations on businesses doing business in certain parts of the world. And we can have with China, I hope, a full diplomatic boycott of the Winter Olympics. So when the Prime Minister refers to an effective boycott, and the Foreign Secretary also repeated those words in a meeting I was in a little earlier, that can only mean a full boycott, and that must include diplomats based in Beijing. It would be absurd if we don't have officials or ministers or MPs or members of the royal family going from the UK, but our ambassador in Beijing still turns up to the Olympics, as apparently she is quite wont to do. That must be made absolutely clear. And the second person I will re-emphasise, it's already been mentioned, is Carrie Lam. It is inconceivable that she should not be on a list, given that we are seeing the impact of the oppression that is snuffing out the freedom and liberty and entrepreneurialism in that country now, because many of those citizens are already coming to this country, and we welcome them, and we will welcome many more who are fleeing the crushing abuses against their freedoms. So can I just ask in finishing, leaving plenty of time, Mrs. Miller, for everybody else to answer all our questions, can I just ask 3 questions to the Minister? Basically, how does the Foreign Office decide who goes on the sanction list? What information do they require? Is there some sort of algorithm that decides it? Because the algorithm has come up with some strange names not to include. What more could we do, including the all-party group, to provide information that might make the Foreign Office's job easier for making sure that the right people and more people go on that list? Secondly, and really importantly, how do we coordinate our list with other countries? I know when there was the initial Magnitsky names, it was on the same day as I think some announcements were made by the EU and with the US. And that is really important, as I said earlier, that it's an internationally coordinated. But there is a question, why is it that the UK has sanctioned only 24% of the individuals and the entities already sanctioned under the United States Magnitsky Sanctions regime? We have common interests, we share the same values. Why is it that 3/4 of the people that the United States think should be applied under Magnitsky Sanctions, we haven't done so here? Have we just not got round to it yet? Is the Foreign Office under-resourced in examining their credentials? Do we not trust the judgment of our allies in the United States? I think some explanation of how the system works would be helpful, because it's a really important innovation, this. It's a really powerful tool, and it's a tool that the UK can proudly use to stand up for the values and the freedoms and the liberties which we take for granted here, but which, alas, many other countries don't. And working with those like-minded countries, we can bring the change and the freedom and the liberty to many people who don't enjoy those luxuries that we do in this country.
Thank you, Mr. Zola. It's very good to see you in the chair this afternoon. And let me congratulate the Honourable Member for Rwanda for gaining the debate, and to the members of the all-party group for the work they're undertaking to highlight the deep and profoundly worrying human rights abuses across the world. Now, I'm sure we all agree that the abuse of individuals, political and religious groups, and indeed minorities across the world by a range of global state actors is well documented, but what is less well documented is the lesser known non-state actors now participating in the field of human rights abuse. Nevertheless, the systematic utilisation of global finance to enable these crimes against humanity in many ways, Mrs Miller, remains cloaked in secrecy, underpinned by the rightfully named, at least as I see it, dark money. Now, dark money is an issue which I and many of my SNP colleagues have taken a very keen interest in since 2015, and like the Honourable Member for Rwanda today in relation to today's debate, we do so for a good reason, believing in an open and transparent political process founded on the rule of law and in parliamentary democracy, a model that seeks to hold government to account for its actions. Now, it used to be said that all roads lead to Rome, a very lovely place indeed, yet from my perspective in the political world today, especially in the age of dark money, the road always seems to lead to the Kremlin. The very debate itself, of course, taking its name from the late Serge Magnitsky, a Russian lawyer, who the Honourable Member for Rwanda alluded to earlier, who uncovered large-scale tax fraud while working for Hermitage Capital, a firm based here in London. Serge, as we know, died in a Russian imprisonment due to mistreatment. It's also well noted that the previous government believed that the then existing fraud legislation was actually enough. And in February 2018, the then Foreign Secretary, now the Prime Minister, argued that the Sanctions and Anti-Money Laundering Bill provided enough powers. Now, at least some of us would say that, luckily, the then Prime Minister recognised the opportunity to improve existing legislation, and the tone changed with the government saying it would consider changes to the Sanctions and Anti-Money Laundering Bill, which has been mentioned by members previously. And we are glad that they came forward. Now, various members have, during the debate, highlighted some of the most egregious abuses of the dignity of the rights of people and peoples across the globe, from the profoundly familiar way in which the Uyghur people are treated and herded by the Communist Party of China to the killing and torture of protesters during the military coup in Sudan. And given that the members have gone into some detail on those points, I won't give another exposition of inhumanity in any more detail. So let me follow the money, which may finance these abuses and undermine democratic governance, specifically in relation to Scottish shell companies who have siphoned billions of dollars, including from the former Soviet Union, and in particular today, that linked, as David Lisk of Open Democracy has cited, to an Uzbek business empire. Now, Mr. Lisk highlights that in a rather unassuming south side of Glasgow trademark tenement lies the official headquarters of a company known as Yardok Development. The investigation by Open Democracy revealed that the company in question is linked to the Uzbek president, Shavkat Mirziyoyev. It comes as no surprise that this company is a Scottish limited partnership, a company structure known globally as the UK's homegrown secrecy vehicle. Indeed, in recent years, some SLPs have been blacklisted by the United Nations Development Programme and even by the World Bank, given the ongoing concerns relating to their ability to undermine transparency, good governance. Scottish limited partnerships are safe ports of storm in murky waters for dark money. These are harbours offering access to doubtful financial probity and dodgy dealings. Let's go back to Mr. Lisk's investigation, in which it states that in a report published this month, Uz Investigations, a group led by Professor Christian Lazlet of Ulster University and supported by the Uzbek Forum for Human Rights, found that 8 specific SLPs, including Yardok Development, owned a total of more than $128 million worth of equity in something known as the Orient Group companies. This is a company which has risen in prominence with the support of the Uzbek state and its leadership, a company with direct links to the president via one of the Orient Group's founders and shareholders, Oybek Umarov, and a brother of Otabek Mamorov, deputy head of the Presidential Security Services and Mirziyoyev's son-in-law. In addition, Uz Investigations have highlighted another senior executive is even a son of a serving minister. Now, Umida Niyazov, director of the Uzbek Forum for Human Rights, echoed other concerns. As more wealth accumulates in the hands of those close to senior state officials, the link between extreme economic and political power becomes stronger, and added, this is a significant threat to any prospect of democratisation in Uzbekistan. Mrs. Miller, this is a slippery slope of authoritarianism, ably assisted by nepotism and by Scottish limited partnerships. Corruption in a political process, if allowed to go unchallenged, undermines the rule of law, undermines the courts, undermines public confidence in liberal democracy, and opens the door to the abuse of the person, a collective of people, a culture, a political movement, and embolden those who use dark money to facilitate it. The role of SLPs in Uzbekistan cannot be glibly ignored. Then need only now look to what's happening in Hong Kong, which has been mentioned briefly. While Hong Kong may not have been in the news as much as it previously has been, it's largely due to the Communist Party's national security law. And let's be under no illusion, what we are witnessing is the death of democracy in Hong Kong. It's a blow. Well, indeed, Mrs. Miller, come to a conclusion in just a moment. It is, instead, what we're seeing in Hong Kong is freedoms destroyed. A rule of law and democracy and rights to the freedom of expression being totally undermined by the Communist Party. Can I just therefore ask the Minister, in their summing up, if they can give some clarity on the position in terms of Hong Kong and those in the Communist Party of Hong Kong? And also, can the Minister state that the Government recognises the impact of Scottish limited partnerships on the future of democracy, not only in these islands, but in Uzbekistan, and their role in facilitating the movement of finance, which is used to undermine human rights across the globe?
Mrs. Miller, it's a pleasure to serve under your chairpersonship, and I want to congratulate my honourable friend from the Rwanda and indeed all in the all-party group and all who've contributed today for the many serious issues that they've raised and the work that they're doing to highlight individuals who they believe should be sanctioned under the Magnitsky regime. And I want to reiterate the official opposition's previous welcome issued to the government for implementing the regime, which of course many in this House had long called for, including some in this room and of course we as an opposition. And I want to put on record again our heartfelt condolences to the family of Sergei Magnitsky, and indeed salute all of those who have campaigned in his honour. Human rights abuses are tragically on the rise globally, and unfortunately the pandemic, as we've seen, has exacerbated those around the world, because we've seen criminals using the global disarray as a vessel to broaden their operations, their corruption, and dictators using the pandemic as an excuse to crush political dissent. And indeed, 70% of countries covered by the Economist's Intelligence Unit Democracy Index have recorded a decline in their overall democracy scores, and the lowest scores since 2006. And we, as an opposition, have pledged to put human rights at the heart of our international policies with consistency, with a commitment and a resolve to act to defend liberties and the rights of all around the world and our international obligations. And this debate is therefore very, very welcome. The Magnitsky Sanctions have, of course, given us the power to stop violations against civilians without subjecting them to the consequences of broader brush sanctions, which, of course, could actually harm them too. They provide accountability for or a deterrent to gross violations of human rights, compliance with international human rights law and respect for human rights, and indeed a respect for democracy, the rule of law and good governance. And we know that sanctions work and have a significant impact, especially if we adopt them in further partnership with allies, because of course they have little impact if they're just used unilaterally, but when we work in concert with our allies, such as those in the United States and the European Union, they can have a huge impact. And also, Mrs Miller, because together the UK, the US, the EU and Canada represent 1/3 of global GDP, yet are also the locations where billions of dirty blood money literally passes through, and the potential to deal an impact on individuals responsible for human rights abuses and corruption is at our fingertips, not least for those who use London has been rightly referred to as their bolt hole. And we welcome now that corruption has been included in the regime of offences in which the sanctions can be applied under the regulations of 2021, and that, we hope, will act as a huge deterrent to the activity that sees some 100 billion illegally flowing through the UK every year, according to the National Crime Agency. Now, of course, we've seen the FCDO designate 49 individuals with sanctions, including visa restrictions and asset freezes, Saudis involved in the death of Jamal Khashoggi, Russians involved in the murder of Sergei Magnitsky, Myanmar generals involved in genocide against the Rohingya, and those involved in North Korean concentration camps. And a year later, we saw 8 designations identified by redress, with 24 sanctions specifically on the basis of corruption. And those included against those in Russia, the Guptas in relation to South Africa, Sudanese businessmen and Latin Americans involved in bribery. Now, I understand that the FCDO will not publish the list of individuals it's investigating to designate for sanctions, and I appreciate the reasons for that. But I have to agree with many of the comments today that we do not believe that the sanctions regime is going far enough in terms of the individuals being designated. And the contrast with the UK, which has only applied 78 designations this year, with the US, which has designated 340 individuals. And indeed, as was referred to by the member for Worthing, the UK has sanctioned only 24% of individuals and entities already sanctioned by the United States Magnitsky regime. So we must go further. Now, there have been many important examples raised today, and I hope the Minister will listen to all of them. I just want to draw attention to a few others. My former brief relating to sub-Saharan Africa, my understanding is that only sanctions have been issued relating to South Africa and Gambia, when, of course, there are many, many other instances and individuals who should be being dealt with. We heard of Sudan today. I want to draw the Minister's attention, of course, to the situation involving Eritrea, and, of course, the horrific situation and human rights abuses, including horrific sexual violence and sexual human rights abuses taking place in Ethiopia. And I hope that the Minister will be considering actively individuals who have been involved in perpetrating crimes there, and of course the wider crimes that have taken place as a result of, for example, the Eritrean regime against its own citizens. We've heard of Sudan, we've heard of Rwanda. We should be considering locations from Cameroon to Zimbabwe for individuals responsible for heinous acts. Russia, Ukraine, Belarus. We've rightly heard a huge amount of attention today to China and Hong Kong. Of course, there have only been 3 sanctions designations against officials in the Chinese regime, despite those horrific abuses against the Uyghur population. And I absolutely agree with the colleagues today who've raised the situation of Chen Guangzhou, prime example of an individual who should face sanctions. And it is absurd that the US has designated that individual, but we have not, and I hope the Minister will listen very closely. We've heard excellent contributions relating to Sri Lanka, and of course I've raised in this place other regimes, including in the Middle East, Bahrain. We've heard also today of Iran. Of course, Mrs Miller, we also need consistency in policies. We need consistency. If we're going to apply sanctions, we also then cannot be cozying up to regimes in other ways. Look at the situation with regard to Saudi Arabia, which my honourable friend, the former Shadow Foreign Secretary, raised in relation to Saudi acquisition of assets here. And I want to also raise the concern that's been raised about parliamentary scrutiny. We have that in the United States Congress. We should have it here. And I hope that the Minister can outline for us the practical ways in which we can be providing information confidentially, not just in debates like this, with due regard to privilege, and how we will be working across government and ensuring information is fed in from all government departments, not just the FCDO.
Thank you, Mrs Miller. And let me start by thanking the Honourable Member for Rwanda for tabling this debate today and for his valuable cooperation as chair of the all-party group with his other colleagues of his APPG2, of course. I'd also like to say I'm very grateful to all honourable members for their very insightful contributions today, and I will try and address all of the points raised, some of the countries raised as well as I can within the time that I have. On the 6th of July 2020, Mrs Miller, this government established the Global Human Rights Sanctions regime under the Sanctions and Anti-Money Laundering Act. And this regime gave the UK a powerful new tool to hold to account those involved in serious human rights violations or abuses. It was intended to target individuals and entities involved in serious human rights violations or abuses rather than entire countries. And our global human rights sanctions regime reinforces our ability to defend the rules-based international system. It complements and it enhances our global leadership of the promotion and protection of human rights around the world. It enables us to use asset freezes and travel bans against those involved in serious human rights violations and abuses, or profit or benefit from them. The human rights included within scope of the regime are the right to life and the rights not to be subjected to torture or cruel, inhumane or degrading treatment, and the right to be free from slavery and forced labour. Since we launched our global human rights sanctions just under a year ago, we have designated nearly 80 individuals and entities, and the designations we have put in place demonstrate this government's commitment to stand up for human rights and minority groups, including in Belarus, Myanmar, China, Russia and North Korea. And for example, on the 22nd of March, the UK sanctioned 4 Chinese government officials and the Public Security Bureau of the Jiangxing Production and Construction Corporation for their role in the serious human rights violations that have taken place and persist against Uyghur Muslims in Jiangxing. These measures were taken alongside measures from the US, Canada and the EU, sending the clearest possible signal that the international community is united in its condemnation of China's human rights violations in Jiangxing and the need for Beijing to end discrimination and oppression in the region. Just briefly, yes.
We heard earlier on of the horrifying story which is coming out of the Uyghur Tribunal. Now, will the Minister commit to examining the findings of the Uyghur Tribunal when its judgment comes out this Thursday?
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for his contribution, and I intend to cover the Uyghur Tribunal later in my speech. Mrs Miller, just last week, and again alongside the EU, the US and Canada, we imposed further sanctions against individuals responsible for violations of human rights in Belarus under our Belarus regime. And we imposed an asset freeze on a key state-owned entity in order to maintain economic pressure on the repressive Lukashenko regime. In addition to our new human rights sanctions, on the 26th of April, we launched our global anti-corruption sanctions regime. And this gives us the means to impose anti-corruption sanctions against individuals anywhere in the world, and it represented a significant step forward for the UK's global leadership in combating corruption around the world and promoting fair and open societies. Since the launch, we've designated 27 individuals who have been involved in serious corruption from 9 different countries. And we will continue to pursue designations and promote our values around the world, using powers under both our global human rights and anti-corruption sanction regimes throughout the year of action, starting from the US-hosted Summit for Democracy taking place over the next two days on International Anti-Corruption Day and International Human Rights Days. Mrs Miller, I recognise that members today refer to certain named individuals, and I'm sure they will fully understand that I cannot speculate. It would be inappropriate for me to do so. But can I just make a little bit very quickly?
Well, there's one person that the Minister could undoubtedly speculate on, because he's been appointed as the Rwandan High Commissioner. Surely the government can announce whether or not they're accepted, whether they're going to agree his agreement or not.
I will come to that specific case a little later. But I just wanted to cover the point about how will Parliament be consulted, how can you be part of the process, because I know that honourable members did raise this. And I want to say that we recognise the range of views expressed by parliamentarians on the best approach to take when it comes to the designations proposals. And we are grateful for the interest that you take in this. And of course, you can continue to engage with the government in the usual ways. The debate was one means, but of course you can write to the Foreign Secretary as well. I want to now just turn to some more of the specific questions and countries that were raised. On Sudan, we have condemned the abuses and will continue to press for accountability, including considering sanctions. But we also note the fragile situation there following the 21st of November deal, which reinstated Prime Minister Hamdok as a first step back towards democratic transition. On the specific point of Rwanda, which the Honourable Gentleman for the Rwanda raises, I can assure him we are following the case of Paul Rusesabagina. He pronounces it better than I do, very, very closely. And I can assure him that the Minister for Africa has raised our concerns about due process. On Kashmir, I recognise the concerns, and we raise these with the governments of India and Pakistan. In terms of the Uyghur Tribunal, we very much welcome any initiative that is rigorous, that is balanced, and raises awareness of the situation faced by the Uyghurs and other minorities in China. And I can assure the Honourable Gentleman that we are following the work of the Uyghur Tribunal very, very closely, and we will study any resulting report very carefully. Of course, Mrs Miller, the policy of successive UK governments is that any determination of genocide or crimes against humanity is a matter for a competent court. On Ethiopia, we and our partners continue to press for an end to hostilities in Ethiopia and for Eritrean forces to withdraw. And we fully support all mediation efforts there. I think it's fair to say the scale of the human rights abuses detailed by the Joint Investigation Report are absolutely horrific. And I note that the government of Ethiopia has set up a task force to take forward recommendations from that report, and we will continue to consider a full range of policy options, including sanctions there. As I've explained earlier, we work very closely with our partners, in particular the US, Canada and the EU, who have Magnitsky-style sanctions legislation. We cooperate very closely with Australia, which last week introduced legislation to its parliament that grants it the power to impose global human rights and anti-corruption sanctions. Because UK sanctions are most effective when they are backed up by a coordinated and collective action. And to conclude, the global human rights sanctions and the global anti-corruption sanctions regime have given the UK new and very important powerful tools. The designations we've already made show that we will act to hold to account those involved in serious human rights violations or abuses or serious corruption without fear or favour. And in close coordination with our allies, we will carefully consider future designations under the regulations. Because, Mrs Miller, through concerted action, we will provide accountability for serious human rights violations or abuses and serious corruption around the world, and deter those who might commit them in the future.
Chris Bryant, to wind up.
Thank you very much, Mrs Miller. Well, I'm afraid the Minister wound me up at the end there, because, to be honest, why the government can't simply say that somebody who has blatantly been involved in the drugging the illegal extradition of somebody to Rwanda, why the government can't say that that person will not be accepted as a representative of Rwanda to the Court of St James as a High Commissioner. I can't understand. That's a very simple ask. I understand why ministers always say, they've said it endlessly to us, oh no, we don't want to speculate about sanctions because that undermines the system and all the rest of it. We don't want ministers to speculate. We want ministers to implement. It's quite simple. And I like the minister enormously. She knows I do. But we want more action. Only 24% of those people who are sanctioned by the United States of America are sanctioned by this country. What is that? Is that because we are more picky? Is that because we're more cowardly? What is it? I don't understand. There's no argument for it so far. So I hope that what the government will do in the new year is they will set aside a whole day for us to debate a whole series, to debate this in proper government time, to understand how we can make sure that the UK is always and will always be the beacon for liberty, for